Greetings, brethren, and welcome to another presentation from upa7.org. Today we're going to discuss splits among Davidian groups and mergers in the era or the period from 1955 up to the current day, to 2022. In documenting this, we're going to address some of the following questions. Why are there so many splinters or groups that have arisen since the death of Brother Houteff? Were you aware that there have been two mergers between Davidian groups in the past? Most people are not aware of this. What led to these circumstances? So we're going to look into that. Also, what lessons can we learn from these splits and mergers? And finally, despite our highly divided situation today, what can we see a clear direction how God is leading today? And this is something a lot of people are confused over, but the answer is definitely yes. So let us begin. As we enter in, let us take this thought for prayer. And we'll be reading from a letter that Ellen wrote in March 6, 1906 to a group of brethren gathered in Graysville, Tennessee. And it reads, "The prosperity of the soul depends upon the oneness that Christ prayed might exist among those who believe in him. They are to be one with him as he is one with the Father. Drawing apart from one another is not God's plan, but the plan of the artful foe. We are to beware of those who are denying their past experience and who, through specious devising, would, if possible, deceive the very elect. He who is our advocate in the heavenly courts is acquainted with every particular of the deceptive wiles of those who are doing this work. Those who are departing from the faith are at work to undermine the confidence of others, and they have been thus at work for years. Our warnings come from the one who is interested in us because he sees our dangers and is acquainted with the conniving of those who are opposed to his truth." So we see in this counsel that certainly God is desiring that we come into unity as Christ is in unity with the Father. However, in our midst, there are going to be those that are going to work apart from God's plan, and they're going to be under the control of the devil, and they're going to they're going to undermine the confidence in the work, they're going to bring about strange teachings, and this will result in division. And this has certainly been the case since the death of Brother Houteff. So we want to document this based on the evidences, the facts of what happened, what was involved, what were the issues, who was involved. So before we begin, please take time to kneel down and pray and meditate and ask the Holy Spirit to guide, lead, and direct you unto all truth. So as we begin, we're going to look at key splits among Davidian groups that have arisen over the years. The first, right after the death of Brother Houteff, was Ben Roden started his branch movement. In 1961, there were a group of Davidians called themselves the 100% Rod-only Davidians, reorganized in Riverside, California, in opposition to Florence Houteff and her renegade executive council. So there was a split there. 1962, right after that meeting in 1961, M.J. Bingham splits with the Warden Vista Association to start his Bashan pasture movement. So we're going to look at all these in more detail. This is just an overview. 1974, Yucaipa Association separates from the Don Adair Salem Association and reorganizes in Southern California. A lot of people forget about Yucaipa, but that was an important storehouse of present truth in the 1970s. In 1983, Wanda Bloom and Erwin Reichman separate from the Yucaipa Association to begin their international GAD SDA in Northern California. Also the same year, about 50 brethren are separated from the Salem Association by Don and Dare and begin to reorganize in Rockaway, New York. This was the beginnings of the Mountaindale group. 1991, Norman Archer and others separate from the Mountaindale Association to begin their New Waco Association. That is, this idea to relocate back to Waco, Texas. And then 2005, Mountaindale suffered a split between two factions. And out of this, UPA7.org arose to meet the need for the publication of Shepherd's Rod literature, initially in the Philippines, but later, turns out, worldwide, to meet a worldwide famine, if you will, for the publication of the Rod literature. And then recently, this year, 2022, Mountaindale is in the process of splitting again in a big controversy over the unauthorized New Code sermon addresses published by Florence Houteff. So we're going to look at each one of these in more detail. Before we begin, we need some rules for analysis. How does one today, say you're coming into the message at some point, we weren't involved in many of these divisions, how do we understand the situation? And it's important to set down some rules so that we can look at it in a, not in an emotional manner, but from the facts of the case. So the first point to consider is, if there is a split in an association resulting in two factions, then the essential question really becomes, who's right and who's wrong? And what are the criteria for making such a decision? This is really the most essential element, because we have to make a judgment call here based on, not on hearsay or stories, but on actual reports and documentation of what took place. Furthermore, without a key to identify whom God is leading, how can a new Davidian sort out this complicated situation? And most people that have come into the message at any point over the last few decades has had to face this reality, and it's often perplexing. And the question becomes, well, where did God's storehouse go after the death of Brother Houteff? And most people can't answer that question. Well, the reason why is because they don't have a key. And the key, just like you need a key to identify the king of the north and king of the south, that is, the successive rulers over the promised land. And Brother Houteff gives us that key. So what's the key to identify where God's storehouse went? And the answer is really simple. Whoever preserved the publication of the original Shepherd's Rod tract literature. That is the simple key. And with that, we can identify those whom God was leading in contrast to various splinters or factions or breakaways that took off with their own uninspired doctrines and so forth. And lastly, we want to look at the conditions and circumstances by which separate Davidian factions came together and actually discussed and formed a merger. A lot of people aren't aware of this, and so we can learn a lot from these two cases. So this is kind of our ground rules to help us, guide us through this sometimes complicated and often murky area of history, but it really isn't once we have some certain platform to, documents and keys to identify who's leading who. So we've created this visual timeline to document major splinters off of the true lineage. And by true lineage, we mean the storehouses that God has preserved the original literature. That's a true lineage, and then everything else is a splinter off of it. So we'll review this once again. Now, we have a video that goes, if you check the link in the description box below, that goes in more detail over this, what we call the scattering time, or the scattering period after the death of Brother Houteff. So it all began over here on the left-hand side under the green arrow in 1930 with Universal Publishing Association. That's what Brother Houteff started. There was no camp, there was no headquarters, there were no bylaws. It started with the publishing work in Los Angeles, California. Later in 1935, the headquarters moved from California to Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas. And there it existed for 20 years. And during that time, Brother Houteff published the complete original Shepherd's Rod message. 15 tracts, answer books 1 to 5, Timely Greetings, Volume 1, Volume 2, 7 miscellaneous tracts, Jezreel letters, and the original symbolic codes, or the old codes, Volume 1, Number 1 to Volume 10, Number 2, all during his lifetime. So when Brother Houteff died, he, thank God, warned us in the Rod message that to watch out for usurpers and office seekers. And sure enough, they have arisen by the score. So one of the first to arise was Ben Roden, who claimed that he was Elijah the prophet that would never die, and began to introduce a number of false doctrines, such as the feast keeping and so forth. So Roden's branch arose. Now, of course, Roden's prediction that he'd be Elijah would never die, of course, in 1978 he died, so it proves that he was a false prophet, but there are fragments and residue from the branch movement that are still existing on today, so hence the arrow, so forth. Now, we're not going to go into any more details about that. The important thing is Florence Houteff also usurped, and this has been well documented. We have videos, check the link in the description box below, her taking over or usurping control of the association, literally the day after Brother Houteff died, and God basically gave her and her counterfeit council about 7 years before they ran the message into the ground and sold off the assets of New Mount Carmel, counterfeited the literature and everything, and rejected the whole message and denounced it as false. So, fortunately, by the grace of God, there were true Davidians that recognized this and opposed her doctrines, her false predictions, and her counterfeit literature. And so they called themselves the 100% Rod-only Davidians. And if you see the green arrow going up, in 1861 they reorganized to oppose Florence Houteff and also to oppose Roden's bogus branch. But as soon as God moves to reorganize, and their mandate actually, which is very important in that 61 reorganization, was basically really simple, and this is all recorded in symbolic codes, is real simple. Their bylaws was reestablish publishing of the original literature and 2, train Bible workers, school of prophets, if you will. And that's it. And it turns out that simple mandate is still in existence today, and that's the one we should be operating under. Well, as soon as God moves, the devil doesn't stand idly by. So usually shortly thereafter, there's a split. Sure enough, in 1962, under that red arrow, there was a split between Brother H.D. Warden, who kept the message alive in the Vista, California area, and then M.J. Bingham. They're ones that reorganized the 61 meeting, but one of them was right and one of them was wrong. And so Bingham started his Carmel pasture, and then later relocated to Exeter, Missouri, and the Bashan group still exists today under their current false porter president, Trevor Bingham. So that's the origin of that offshoot. Now, a lot of people don't realize, but Don Adair was a pupil under Bingham, and he later separated from Bingham and joined the Vista group, which in 1970 relocated to Salem, South Carolina. And shortly thereafter, Don Adair, by coup d'etat essentially, got himself voted into vice president and began to publish things in their symbolic code that created division, and a group split in 1974 and reorganized back in Houteff, California, under the original 1961 charter. And then Don Adair maintained control of the Salem group all the way up literally to this day, although that's about to fall apart. He claims to be in Salem, but actually he's 6 miles west of there in a town called Tomasi, South Carolina, and has been there for decades. Now, Houteff in 1986 merged with Mountaindale. And what most people don't realize is that Mountaindale was cast, a group of brethren were in the New York area were cast out of Don Adair's Salem Association. They later discovered these Davidians out in Houteff that were publishing the original literature, and they merged in 1986. We'll look at that in more detail. And then that merger, the devil didn't stand idly by. Shortly thereafter, in 1991, a group of Davidians led by Norman Archer fomented for a relocation back to Waco and formed the New Waco Association and a small portion of the original property. And then later in 2005, Mountaindale split, and then UPA7.org organized out of necessity to reestablish publication of the original Shepherd's Rod literature. Mountaindale was no longer publishing it. So that's a brief timeline of who kept the Rod literature alive, and then the splinters of these various factions that bring us all of these different counterfeit groups that we see today. So let's look at a little bit more detail on each one, some of the facts. Now, the origin of Rhoden's bogus branch. Here is a track. It looks like it might be a Rod track, but it is not. It is a counterfeit at the 11th hour. This is a Rhoden publication. So right after the death of Brother Houteff, Benjamin Rhoden rose up and claimed that he was Elijah the prophet that would never die. Many unread Davidians were duped. And so he got a hold of the mailing list, and there were many that ended up following Rhoden. They didn't believe that Brother Houteff would ever die. Well, Brother Houteff died, and so they were duped by Bingham's claim, which later proved out to be false. He died in 1978, proving that he was indeed a false prophet and introduced a number of false doctrines. So Rhoden introduced the doctrine of literally keeping feast days into the Davidian movement, and this was one of his major hallmarks. And many Davidians today still follow this outside the branch, as well as many Seventh-day Adventists. So unfortunately, Rhoden gets credit for this. He used a number of methods, but primarily letters, to promote his doctrines and oppose the apostasy of Florence Houteff. So once again, he used the printing press to exalt himself and oppose the errors of Florence Houteff. Now, what are some facts about Florence Houteff in her reign of terror, if you will, for a period of 7 years from 1955 to 1962? Well, Brother Houteff died February 5th. It was a Sabbath in the evening. And so Brother Houteff died literally the next morning, on a Sunday morning, February 6th. Florence Houteff convenes a meeting of the Executive Council, one of 4 meetings that day. She convened it at 8:30 in the morning, and at the end of the day, she usurped the leadership and had herself voted in. She removed the office of president and had herself installed as vice president. She's the one that created that leadership model, and unfortunately, many people still follow it today. So in this period from 1955 to 58, she published the unauthorized New Symbolic Codes, which introduced a number of false doctrines and alleged sermons claimed to be from Brother Houteff. So this is a raging controversy amongst Davidians that really erupted around the late 1990s, and is still very much amongst us today, as we'll see as we go forward. November 55, and she predicted the 42-month period that would end in the spring of 1959, and then would result in Ezekiel 9. Now, this was in Symbolic Code, Volume 11, Number 1. So a lot of Davidians wonder why don't we publish that? Well, it's obvious, because it contained error, and the whole host of those symbolic codes published by her are contaminated. They're a mixture of truth and error, and the only safe thing to do with them, the wise Davidians recognize, is to burn them all. They're unauthorized. So this is a textbook case. In 1957, Old Mount Carmel was completely sold off, and the proceeds were used to purchase New Mount Carmel near Elk, Texas. Now, the order to sell off the original property was given by Brother Houteff in 1954, September, Symbolic Code, Volume 10, Number 1, published by Brother Houteff. Sell off first a part, then the whole. And this, of course, was accomplished according to God's ordering by 1957. Now, this property, this call to buy new property, was not in the message. And this New Mount Carmel, of course, was contaminated not only with Florence, but it was later taken over by Ben Rhoden, and then later by David Koresh, and was the site of the infamous 1993 burnout involving David Koresh and the United States government. So this was obviously not a place of God's ordering. 1959, she called a solemn assembly at New Mount Carmel, and over 1,000 Davidians were gathered. This has all been documented. Of course, this is a false doctrine. The solemn assembly was never to be called by a false prophet, such as Florence Houteff, but this is what happened, and a lot of Davidians still think that they're going to call a solemn assembly sometime in the future. They're really following Florence Houteff's example and not the original Rod. We have a whole video on that solemn assembly. It might shock you. Check the link in the description box below, but you'll find out that the solemn assembly was ongoing in Brother Houteff's day. If you don't believe that, go study the Rod or check out the video. We'll show you the references there. And then in April 22, 1959, the infamous 42-month time-setting false prophecy fails, in a dismal failure. It proved that Florence Houteff was once again a false prophet. And then shortly, couple years later, March 1, 1962, Florence Houteff and her executive council resigned in shame and disgrace, and New Mount Carmel, what was left of it, was given into receivership of a Texas lawyer, and then later taken over by Ben Roden through a number of court battles in the Texas courts in the 1960s. So that was the end of Florence Houteff. She renounced the message, claimed that Brother Houteff and Sister White were false prophets, and if anybody, Davidians, still believed in the kingdom, they should join R.W. Armstrong's Radio Church of God. So what a dismal disgrace to the message. But thank God there were faithful Davidians that opposed this and reorganized in 1961. So what are some of the facts behind this reorganization? Well, M.J. Bingham started a publication called the Timely Truth Educator, or the TTE for short, and he used this publication to oppose some of the errors of Florence Houteff and her executive council, and to call for reorganization. This reorganization was done by Brother Harry Warden and M.J. Bingham. They were the two principals that called for reorganization and convened a special session in Riverside, California. It was announced in two successive codes of what they called the restored symbolic codes. They recognized the symbolic codes of Florence Houteff were clearly problematic because of their obvious false time-setting errors, so they restored the symbolic code, at least to its original purpose, to call for a session. And if you study Leviticus, you'll see that the symbolic code is the means by which a session is called, or in this case, a special session, and to document the proceedings of this reorganization. So the copies of these pre-session and session codes are available, and you can find out all the details of what happened. And we have copies if anybody's interested in this literature. Now, the devil didn't stand idly by. Shortly thereafter, there was a split in 1962. And what were the facts? A lot of people don't know. Bashan will give you their side of the story, but it's very biased and warped. They don't tell you the whole story, so we'll tell that for you. In 1961 session placed M.J. Bingham as editor of the publishing work, and this led to problems. What were the problems? Well, Bingham thought he was wiser than most and literally demanded total control over the editorial work and had the final say what was published and what wasn't. That's rather authoritarian and certainly not of God, and so some brethren recognized that and opposed this. And so what was the result is the executive council, who was led by Brother Warden, removed two members, the treasurer and the editor of the publication. It turns out that this was M.J. Bingham and his adulterous second wife. If you don't know that story, you can check out a video in the link in the description box below called Bashan Hill Exposed for all the documentation on that, and Bingham and his false doctrines and his... So they were dismissed or removed for collusion together and promoting heresy. However, Bingham didn't stand idly by. They had, in 1961, formed a SC, which stands for a standing committee, who was chaired by Don Adair. Apparently that was to protect the executive council. If the executive council went astray, this standing committee, which was separate brethren, could come in and call a check to it. So Don Adair persuaded the members of the standing committee to overthrow Worden and the executive council and establish a new executive council under Bingham. So now you have two rival councils. So the question, who's right and who's wrong? Well, Worden and a quorum refused to concede the assets to the association. The assets were the ability to print the literature, the office equipment, the mailing lists. And remember, back in the 60s, they didn't have email, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have Zoom meetings, so they relied on mailing lists to contact brethren and make announcements and so forth. So this resulted in Adair and the Bingham together taking the matters into their own hands. Well, what did they do? They tried to paint the picture that they did what was right, but this is the facts of the case. M.J. Bingham and Don Adair broke into the association office located at 5667 Stover Avenue, Arlington, California. It was a private home, but in that home, they held the association's assets and did the publishing work. So Adair and Bingham broke in on two separate occasions and stole a variety of equipment and important documents, including the mailing list. Brethren, that's plain and simple. That's a violation of the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. Despite the long-winded efforts of Adair to justify this, they were thieves. Nobody gave them permission or a key to go in and take these assets. They committed a crime and a sin against God. So this is no justification for starting your association. We're going to see this type of behavior happen again in the future, so pay attention closely. So we have documentation of what actually took place. We have all the documents if you're interested on the rest of the details. Later in 1966, there was a merger. Now, most of us would know about this except for this very important document called Davidian, the Inside Report. And this, we have a digital scan of this, but this chronologues the history of the storehouse from 1961 all the way up until the mid-1970s. So here's the details of this session that was held July 2nd and 3rd, 1966, and I'll literally read it verbatim. It says, on July 2nd, 1966, the session Sabbath service were held at the Zion Apostolic Assembly Church in Santa Ana, California. The following day, so they had the religious meetings first, and then the next day they held a business meeting. And that was held at the office at the 1202 West 5th Street, Santa Ana, California. This was a joint session of the, quote, DSDA Association and the Shepherd's Rod Publishing Association of DSDA. A resolution was made and adopted to wit, namely, that the DSDA Association and the Shepherd's Rod Publishing Association of DSDA would merge on the condition that the name, the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association, be the name of the association as set forth in Leviticus, page 3, and 2TG number 43, pages 3 and 4, and also 5 Symbolic Code number 3, page 8. How did there end up with these two groups? We really don't know all of the details, but one of them was involved in publishing the original literature, and the other one was somehow separated in. Things were kind of chaotic, and they are still chaotic to this day. But what was remarkable is that these two groups came together in agreement and unified, or merged, and we'll continue on. More details. Sidney Smith was elected session chairman, and Nancy Zeller was elected session secretary. The bylaws of the Leviticus were adopted, that is the original 1943 Leviticus, published by Brother Houteff, and then they were amended or new ones enacted, and then they see Exhibit A. Now, if you're interested, you can see their bylaws that were published there, and they were fairly short, a couple pages. Really simple. The mandate was republish the original literature and train Bible workers. At the session, the Shepherd's Rod Association merged with the DSDA Association, and the association was carried on under the legal government, or Articles of Incorporation and Bylaws, as the DSDA Association operated under prior to the merger. Therefore, this is not a new association, it's just a continuation of the one already in existence. And this was coming from the charter or the bylaws of the 1961 reorganization. So this was not a new group. And this whole document goes on all the details why they make the efforts to point this out. It goes on further. The officers elected to serve for the upcoming year were as follows: Brother H.T. Warden, Vice President, following the example of Florence, unfortunately, and her leadership model. Sister Wanda Adair Bloom. Now, Wanda had been married to Don Adair, but they divorced, and then she remarried a brother named Howard Bloom. So a lot of marriages and divorces in Davidia over the years. So she became secretary. Brother Cecil Hellman, treasurer and editor. He was involved in the publishing work. Brother E.F. Reichman, Glenn Green, W.E. Baker, and Sister Martha Stevenson were the remaining regular council members. There were 3 council members elected from each of the 2 association's previous councils, and one that hadn't belonged to either of the previous 2 councils. The main thrust of the session seemed to be unity. The mailing address of the association was changed to 2020 Edge Hill Drive, Vista, California, and this was the home at the time of Brother Ward and his wife. In February 1967, the council asked Brother Baker to resign because he lived so far away, and they replaced him with Sister Lula Mae Newsom in March 1967. So this is all recorded. If you want all the details, you can certainly read them. We'll provide them for you. But this is the essential element, showing that, in fact, in an era where there's lots of splinters or breakaways, God does move upon brethren to come together, to unify, to advance the original message. Now we'll look at some of the facts about the 1974 split that took place at Salem. So the Vista Association in California voted to relocate the publishing work to the Salem Rest Home in 1969. And this rest home was, of course, known from the days of Brother Houteff, and so they recognized that that would be an important part of the work in the future. And so they held their first session was held in 1970. This was not a new association. This was simply a relocation. Don Adair, who had separated from Bashan, joined up and became a session, the head of the session, and also a Bible worker. And he used this as an opportunity to get into position. He recruited converts that he had won in the Riverside, California area, in Southern California, and he basically misled them and promised them if they relocated out to Salem that they would have jobs and be able to involve in the work. Well, the executive council never approved it, so Don Adair used it as a power play, and so he got these groups of brethren to move out to the Salem area, and they, with the intention to vote him in as vice president, and that's exactly what happened in 1973. I have an eyewitness testimony, somebody that was part of that. So he deceived them in order to get himself voted into position. So Adair, after he got in control, began to introduce controversial doctrines in the Salem Symbolic Code. And most of the brethren were still back in California, and this created division, and it resulted in a formal split in 1974. And there was a letter signed by 12 brethren. Since they could not reconcile with Adair's various doctrines, it was things on the flying saucer, personal issues of his marriage, proving that he married the third wife, was a virgin, and all kinds of stuff that really didn't belong in the symbolic code. And so these brethren called for is irreconcilable. So brethren back in Yucaipa, most of them were in Yucaipa, reorganized under the original 1961 charter and began to print original rod track literature. And they continued on up until the merger with Mountaindale in 1986. So this is some of the interesting facts about the Salem split. Now, from this day forward, Don Adair has maintained control as vice president of Salem ever since, up until recently. Salem is breaking apart because of Don Adair's old age and inability to lead. So he's been in control ever since. Now, here's some pictures of that movement. There's that session at the Salem Davidian Church that took place in 1970. So there's some of the brethren there. And there's that rest home that was built in 1946. And Brother Houteff actually visited this place. But they remodeled what they call the big room. And that became the print shop. So on this photo on the bottom right, you see the printing equipment. It was an A.B. Dick offset duplicator. And they continued to print original tract literature, and we have some copies of that left over from those days in Salem. So that was the relocation to Salem, and then the split. Facts about the 83 Yucaipa split. What happened? Well, the headquarters was there in Southern California, and it moved from different locations. It was in Arlington, or Riverside, Arlington, Vista, and then later ended up in Yucaipa, and there was a split in Yucaipa. So what happened here? There was sharp disagreement about what should be published by the association. Wanda Bloom had produced over a dozen remodeled tracts, which removed the name of Brother Houteff and gave credit to a, quote, compiler. Wanda Bloom and Erwin Reichman separated from the Yucaipa Association because they wanted to do their own thing and began the International GAD-STA in Northern California and continue on with their counterfeit literature and unauthorized symbolic codes. So Wanda Bloom started their symbolic code, started with Volume 1, Number 1, and we have a whole video, if you want to check it out, link in the description box below, about a whole number of counterfeit symbolic codes that have arisen, starting with Florence Houteff, but every association along the way has done their own codes all the way up till the current day. So this Cal Mesa Association, that's their location when they first started in 83, later moved to Red Bluff, California, and still exists today. They publish no original Shepherd's Rod literature and are a host to a number of false doctrines. So let's look at some of the plagiarized tract studies from Yucaipa. Some of you might recognize these. Mount Dale had a version of these. These they don't look like original. They certainly aren't. They were approximately part of an 18-part tract series that appeared beginning and starting in 1975. And there was no credit given to the original author. Now, when you read these, the content is basically Rod teaching, first fruits, second fruits, the 144,000, the teaching of Hosea 1 and 2, the layman's movement, but no credit to Brother Houteff. And this was the brainchild of Wanda Bloom. And the credit was given to J. Walters as the compiler. Now, this was quite a mystery. We first discovered these in the Philippines, and I didn't have any idea who this J. Walters compiler was. Turns out this literature was spread all over the Philippines. When I was there with my wife in 2003 through 5, we discovered this literature. And we'll tell the story about how we found out about who published it. And this created, at the time in the early 70s, mid-70s, division in the Yucaipa group. And there were brethren that says, no, we should not counterfeit Brother Houteff's work. We should stick with the original. So this is what led to the split. Wanda wanted to continue on, so she got sympathizers, and that's what created this split. So what Cal Mesa basically did was plagiarize Rod, and these are the tracts that we saw that were spread abundantly throughout the Philippines in the in the 1980s, early 80s. So when we discovered these, I didn't recognize them, and so I asked the brethren, where did you get these from? And they said, well, they came from the United States. And I go, well, who published them? And finally a sister said, well, I can't remember the woman's name, but a sweet old lady from California. And I'm like, California? And I said, was her name Wanda Bloom? And she says, oh, yeah. It was Sister Wanda. And I go, oh, that's interesting. So these are the tracts, I would call them pseudo or fake tracts, they're compiled by J. Walters. And inside they contained blatantly plagiarized artwork. This is a rendition or remodel of the Zechariah chapter 6 chart. The coloring's been changed, so it's a complete remodel of it. And so who did this? So dramatically reformatted charts appear, new copyright dates, taking credit as if it belongs to this J. Walters. Well, I finally found out who J. Walters was when one day I was visiting Sister Bonnie Smith in Salem, South Carolina, and Sister Bonnie knows Wanda Bloom quite well. And I asked Sister Bonnie, who's J. Walters, this compiler of these tracts? And she goes, oh, that's Wanda. And I'm like, how do you know? Oh, that's her maiden name. So Wanda J. Walters was Wanda Bloom's maiden name. She remarried 3 times, and she became Wanda Adair for a while, and then Wanda Bloom, and I don't know what she is today, but that was origins. She's the one that counterfeited the raw literature, and that's what created division. Now, 83 was also the same year that Salem split, so one of the facts there. Well, as Salem approached their 1982 session, back then they still held the semblance of some kind of sessions, even though Don Adair had been vice president ever since 1974. But the rumor was, amongst the brethren, a lot of them up in New York, that they were in favor of nominating Anthony Hibbert to become the vice president. Anthony Hibbert was a Bible worker under Don Adair in Salem, and he was very successful sharing the message in the New York area. And there were over 50 converts into the Rod message, and he was a very effective teacher. Well, Don Adair could not tolerate a threat to his control over the association and his leadership as vice president. So what did Don Adair do? Well, he resurrected or brought forth this Bingham doctrine on the those with, this idea that there'll be more than 144,000 saved lives from the church. Bingham called it the non-lineal descendants. He's the origin of this doctrine. It has nothing to do with the original Rod. But Don Adair pulled this thing out of his hat to single out during a public meeting. Anthony Hibbert called him out and asked him if he accepted this doctrine. Don Adair introduced it to these brethren, and Hibbert was caught off guard. And he said, well, he didn't see it in the Rod and would take time to look, investigate it. Well, Don Adair charged him with apostasy and put him under discipline, and used it as so later Mountaindale studied it out and came back and said, we don't see any truth in this doctrine, and published their own study. We have copies of all this. And they said, we can't agree with your teaching on this. And so Don Adair used this to disqualify Anthony Hibbert and remove him from fellowship and no longer support him as a Bible worker. With this, he literally cut off his pay without warning and left him unable to support himself and pay rent. And this created an outrage. So Adair's treatment of Brother Hibbert caused many brethren in that area to protest and call for a special session. Their efforts were rebuffed by the resident council. That's how Salem works. That's really just him and his wife, his third wife. And so the brethren got in their cars and drove down to Salem and wanted to settle sort the issue out. And Adair met them at the door and declared that they disobeyed orders from headquarters, and they revoked their certificate of fellowship cards and literally left them out in the cold. So these brethren were dismayed and returned back to New York, and all they had was a couple sets of charts, and they began to pray and fast and say, well, Lord, what can we do? We can't agree with this anymore. What are you going to do? And God led them eventually to reorganize in that New York area. So about 50 brethren from that area regrouped in a private home in Rockaway, New York, and began to search for a location to set up a camp. And then later, they purchased a Jewish camp in Mountaindale. So that's the rest of the story on how Mountaindale got started. But what's interesting is there's a second merger. And a lot of people don't know about this, but in 1986, Mountaindale merged with Houteff. So what are some of the facts behind this? Well, the brethren located in New York purchased the remnants of an old Jewish camp in Mountaindale. But what they were lacking was the means to publish literature. And they discovered a group of older Davidians out in California, Yucaipa Association, that were still publishing the original Rod tract literature. So they sent 3 brethren out to visit with them and discuss about the publishing work, because they really needed literature. And what happened is the 2 groups agreed to have a joint session the next year, and in 1985 they met and agreed on a formal merger, which happened the next year. And so they continued to print the literature in Yucaipa. Then later, about 1990, the printing press was relocated from Yucaipa to Mountaindale. And so Mountaindale then continued to publish facsimile or photographic reproduction or original literature up until around the year 2000. They began to change it. Well, God moved the storehouse from Yucaipa to Mountaindale, but the devil wasn't going to stand idly by, and he fomented a rebellion, and there was a split. You see history repeating itself, just like after the 61 reorganization, there was a split. Well, there was a split that became what we call New Waco. So what happened here? Well, after the discovery of the old codes, a small group of Mountaindale members began to agitate for relocation to an area of Old Mount Carmel Center, Waco, Texas, based on a small collection of references. Now, these brethren didn't know about the old codes, and it turns out Sister Bonnie Smith was the only person that had a complete set of the old codes. She preserved them from Volume 1, Number 1, to Volume 10, Number 2. And so when these brethren in Mountaindale discovered this, they were really excited. We could certainly understand why, so they eagerly read through them. However, some of them, or one of them, who was really seeking for an office or a position of influence, grabbed some of those references talking about the history of relocating from California to Waco and says, oh, we got to go back there today. So this issue of relocation was introduced and vigorously discussed during sessions held in 1988 and 1990. And the group session voted down this idea to relocate on both cases. They held a special investigative committee that went down and looked at the property and the feasibility, and that whole report was published. We have that document about this attempt to relocate. So it was voted down on 2 successive sessions. However, the rebellion wasn't going to go away, so a faction led by Norman Archer, the office seeker and the architect behind this rebellion, and others voted for an unauthorized special session in 1991 to be convened at the camp there in Mountaindale, and which formalized a split. Now, we have proven that this special session is unauthorized and null and void. It does not follow the Leviticus. The original Leviticus, the authority to call a special session was vested solely in the hands of the Executive Council. And Mountaindale's Executive Council said no. But Archer got the brethren to vote on it from the field. And they held this vote, and it came out like 52 for and 50 against. And so by popular vote, that is legally null and void. It has no authority. So their whole beginnings of the New Waco is based on a false premise and unauthorized. So the New Waco faction was determined, and they needed the literature. So rather than trust in God and start their own, a group of them literally assaulted the Mountaindale camp on a Sabbath day. Now, on Sabbath, most of the Mountaindale brethren would travel out to visit local Adventist churches to participate in Sabbath school and so forth. They left behind a certain brother Terry Harrison, who you can ask him. He was the one left behind, and these Waco brethren showed up and literally, physically assaulted him or restrained him, and they stole the printing press. I mean, that is a criminal offense. Not only stealing, but physical assault. They were not successful, however, because the brother called the authorities, and the New York State Patrol intercepted the brethren at Port Jarvis, New York, just before they went into Pennsylvania. And had the printing press relocated back to Mountaindale. So is that how God leads a group of people to steal? And the answer is no. Just like Bashan started off with thievery. These people, if they really thought God was leading them, they would have separated and asked God to provide for them, honestly, without stealing. So these are hallmarks of counterfeits. They always start with a lie. And of course, all of the details are recorded in this historic session code. Now, we did a video recently, link in the description box below, where we exposed the bylaws of this code that are not in harmony with the original Leviticus, any way, shape, or form. But in here you can find the official separation from Mountaindale, the new executive council chosen, following the example of Florence Houteff, voting and nominating officers rather than having a president chosen by God to select his own executive council like Brother Houteff did. So they're all counterfeit. Their bylaws were created and totally full of man-made doctrines. You can look at for yourself, and then they appointed new ministers. So this is a true rebellion of the nature of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, which is what the Mountaindale Brethren called it, which is exactly what it is. It's almost like a repetition of an age-old rebellion. Okay, Mountaindale continues on, but they split in 2005. What happened here? Well, in 2005, Mountaindale split into two factions stemming from disagreements over the discipline of an erring leader/minister in their regular session in the year 2004. Now, my wife and I were members of Mountaindale at that time. We were working in the Philippines, and we're planning to return in 2004 in the spring and attend a session. But at the last minute, there was a major emergency in the Philippines, and we were not able to return back to the States. We ended up staying there for an entire year, so we missed that session. When I returned in 2005, Mountaindale was in a complete chaos. There was emails and charges, 2 executive councils, and another faction called Chariot, and accusations flying left and right. One sympathizing with this erring leader and others opposing, wanting to kick him out. So the group, that's a whole story in and of itself. And we're probably going to do an interview and a documentary about that split. You can find out more details. But basically, with these 2 rival councils, a group broke away and immediately began to hold meetings through telephone conference calls and made plans to how to reorganize. Now, I was invited to attend those meetings, so I'm an eyewitness of that group that broke away, kind of 2 factions. We called them the 2 families, the white family and the black family. And that kind of split down those lines, friends and family. And the focus of this reorganization primarily was they were obsessed with locating getting a headquarters or a camp and then gathering the ties. And I attended 2 of these meetings with another brother. I was living in South Carolina or North Carolina at the time, and there was so much commotion and chaos. There were some that were, we got to be in the East, according to Ezekiel 47. Other ones, no, we got to be back in California. So there's all this chaos. It was just a lot of politicking. So we stepped out of it and said, we'll wait for this thing to settle down. Meanwhile, when my wife came back to the Philippines, we needed literature desperately, and I went back to Mountaindale in 2006 to talk to them about publishing literature, and they had no interest. They blew me off and said, we're going to the zoo. And so God says, well, they went to the zoo, leave them alone. And that's how we started UPA 7, was to meet the emergency of getting printed literature in the Philippines. And it turns out later it became a worldwide problem throughout Africa and everywhere. So this group that broke away made efforts to reproduce the Rod track literature from a location in Middle Tennessee. The problem was it wasn't right. It wasn't the right size. The artwork wasn't original. It wasn't typeset. It wasn't the original literature. So the whole thing was, God couldn't bless it. We know, we tried it in the Philippines, and if you don't do it right, God can't bless you. You have to seek the Lord and do it right. So what happened? Well, later, for unknown reasons, the group broke apart. at least two of the organizers literally crawled back to Mountvale and seeking reconciliation. Actually, one of them is sitting on their executive council. So I guess they didn't have any real conviction of why they separated from the heirs of Mountvale in the first place. They went back to the trough, I guess. Strange thing. So that's what happened to that split. But the blessing was that God helped reorganize and establishing the publication of the original literature in 2006, and now locations around the world. So here's a couple pictures of that. Here on the left are two of the leaders. The one, Brother McCoy, was the leader from the 2004 session of Mountvale, and he's having a discussion with this other brother, Melvin Wallace, who's a leader from Waco. What was Waco doing there? Well, Waco was there to proselytize. They tried to proselytize me. They were trying to feed off this chaos and recruit people to go back to New Waco under Archer and his gang of hoodlums. They tried to proselytize me, and I rebuked them sharply and called them a bunch of buzzards. They're feeding off this carnage. And they used to be brethren with Waco. There was a lot of weird things that happened there. Maybe someday we'll tell you more of that story with some interview that's with people that were there. But on the picture on the other side is this group that broke away and reorganized in the print shop here. And tragedy is most of these people I knew, where are they today? Some of these brethren from Canada, some of them have disappeared. They just no longer active in the message. Some of them are in deep apostasy and living in open sin. Some of the Spanish brethren from Mexico have disappeared. So it's really a tragedy, but this group has been literally fragmented and splintered. Unfortunately, many of them have left the message or are no longer active. And this is the case, Sister Bonnie can tell you more about this, that when Davidian groups split, oftentimes there's a lot of carnage. A lot of people get disillusioned and discouraged and leave the message, which is a tragedy. Nobody should leave the message. We should always get back and strive to follow, because God is leading a faithful remnant. Now, this brings us to the current split in Mountvale this year, 2022. So Mountvale held a session July of 2022, and the central focus was on the new codes. So there was sharp disagreement over the authority of the new codes. Well, what happened? We predicted in advance that they're going to split, because there are people in Mountvale that are deeply entrenched in those new codes, and they're out there spinning all kinds of fables. Their chief architect, Errol Stanford, and we have openly opposed these and exposed these heretical justifications for the new codes. So the key new code doctrines, so they doubled down, tripled down. They've known about this for years, but they went so far in this session to encode them into their bylaws, and then followed it up with a mandate which forced all of their paid Bible workers to sign an agreement to teach said doctrines or false doctrines from the new codes. Now this is remarkable, because there were two paid Bible workers there that gave presentations to expose the errors of the new codes and call for reform. Well, the other leaders doubled down and rejected that, and then put them in the corner, if you will, and gave them no choice. Sign on the line or else. So, of course, these two brethren, in their conscience, could not agree to teach falsehood. God would hold them accountable. So what do you think's going to happen? A split. It's inevitable. Even though there are people that thought they could reconcile and bring Mountvale around, well, sorry, folks. Can two walk together lest they be agreed? Surprise, surprise, the Bible's always true. So there's no way to reform Mountvale. They have chosen their ways, and as God impressed me in 2006, leave them alone. They went to the zoo. So consequently, we now have on the scene the appearance of the 11th hour ministry has arisen. Now people have asked, so these two brethren, about 5 brethren, are reorganizing. They're having meetings as we speak. And people have asked them, well, is this a new association? They go, oh, no, but we're going to call ourselves the 11th Hour Ministry. They're afraid to identify themselves. I guess they don't really know what to do. So we asked the question, when are they going to publish and distribute tract literature? How are they going to reach 22 million Seventh-day Adventists around the world? They don't have an answer. We've talked to a couple of them. And they think that they're going to go back and get literature from Mountaindale. I'm like, what? Are you crazy? If you separate from them because of their errors, why go back to their trough and ask them to do your literature? I mean, they're looking back like Lot's wife looking back on Sodom and Gomorrah. If they really believe in God, the irony is that we already have the answers to this. Advance, don't retreat. Go forward and set up publishing houses original. But the irony is they don't believe that. They say, oh, there should only be one publishing house. Why? We ask. And because Brother Houteff only had one publishing house. I said, brother, that was in 1955. Nowadays, there was only 1 million Adventists worldwide back then. Now there's 22 million. It's in the message, 17140, through our publishing houses, the message of that other angel, the fourth angel. That's a shepherd's rod message. We've proven it. We're setting up publishing houses literally right now in Zambia. It's happening as we speak. Okay? But they don't believe it. This is a strange thing because there are people that are opposed to this idea. They falsely charge us we're teaching people to pocket their tithes and do whatever they want. I said, no, that's a lie. We don't teach anybody to do that. We teach people how to reorganize a full-fledged, tithe-worthy publishing house in their country. We don't take their tithe, but people don't believe this. So this is a sad irony. So what's going to happen with this ministry? So are their claims to separate from the errors of Florence Houteff and Donna Dare going to be realized or simply overlooked? So are they going to reorganize and set up another executive council following the model of Florence Houteff? Are they going to vote and nominate officers? Are they going to put in a VP? We'll wait and see. Where are they going to get their literature from? The tragedy is, brethren, that we've already solved these problems, but because of their pride, they can't accept it. We've invited them, and we'll freely sit down and discuss with anybody about how God is leading today to set up publishing houses worldwide. So what can we learn from these splits and mergers? Well, ever since the death of Brother Houteff, Davidians have experienced a continual series of splits into numerous factions, which can be best understood as the scattering time. We have a whole video on this that to understand it. It's really, God knew this was going to happen. The devil's going to create commotion and splinters, but it's really a blessing in disguise because now we're a scattered flock. We're not consolidated into some Jerusalem center, which is all kinds of trouble, just like in Ellen White's day, in Battle Creek. So God allows this to happen so that these scattered flock will reorganize and publish their own publishing houses to reach the 22 million Adventists. So that's really the blessing in disguise. God uses apparent defeat as a means to prosper and advance his message. So please watch that video if you haven't seen it already. Despite the many splinter groups, there have been 2 occasions where Davidian groups have joined together to advance the Rod message. So if that's happened in the past, is it possible that some of these brethren from Mountaindale could break away and join together with UPA 7 and start their publishing in their own country? And the answer is certainly. We're willing to discuss it. If they're willing to come back to the foundation and publish, teach only that which is published, the original Rod message, we'll see what happens. Nothing's impossible with God. So in every instance where a split occurred, one has to ascertain who's right and who's wrong in a dispassionate manner as possible, using the best evidences available at our disposal. Most of us weren't there, but there's plenty of documented evidence to form a good, solid conclusion. Who was God leading and who were the counterfeits? And you know them by their fruit. The same way you test a Bible prophet. By their fruit you know them. To the law and the testimony. If they speak not according to these, there's no light in them. So follow who preserved and kept alive the original literature. And that's the key. So with some effort, it is possible to determine who is the true lineage of faithful Davidians who've held high the banner of truth by preserving the integrity of the original Shepherd's Rod message through the published literature from 1955 up to the present day. It's irrefutable. So this concludes our study. We appreciate your attention, your time. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to contact us anytime. We are upa7.org, our email, our phone number. You can text us, call us, or connect with us through WhatsApp. That's our WhatsApp number. Or better yet, let us help you set up an original publishing SRod publishing house so that you can print the literature in your own company. We're happy to talk with you. We're doing it right now. We want 1,000 publishing houses around the world. Do you want to join us? We don't ask control or anybody. We have no president, no vice president, no porter, no executive council. We're just laymen. We're self-supporting Bible workers, and that's how we work. We follow the mandate of the 61 reorganization. Print the literature and train Bible workers. You don't need somebody to tell you what to do. The marching orders are already in the rod, so let's just follow them, brethren. May God bless your search for truth as for hidden treasure, and to know that we have not followed cunningly devised fables. Take care and Godspeed.